Greetings, everyone. My name is David Ouellette, and I'm Associate Professor of Art History and the co-chair of the art program here at College of DuPage. And I'd like to welcome you to our final Visiting Artist Series event of the 2020-2021 series. The Visiting Artist Series is a collaboration between the Cleve Carney Museum of Art and the Departments of Art, Architecture, and Photography at COD. As a reminder, this and all of our events are archived on the Cleve Carney Museum of Art website, theccma.org. Also, the artists that we have joining us today are also present in the chat of the live stream. So if you have questions as you're watching, please feel free to hop in and ask any of your questions there. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that as the descendant of settlers, I live, work, and study as a guest on the unceded and occupied ancestral homelands of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, Sioux, Fox, and Sauk peoples who were subjected to the harmful policies of forced removal, eradication, and re-education by the United States government and its colonial enterprises. This land acknowledgement is a simple gesture of respect and gratitude for the past, present, and future Native peoples that continue to steward this land and its water. I hope it encourages others to stand in solidarity with Native peoples in this country and around the world in their struggle for reconciliation, sovereignty, and land restoration. Today, I'm joined by three artists whose work intersects with nature and engages with our current ecological moment. This moment is characterized by many as a crisis spurred by human activity in the form of extractive capitalism. This crisis has caused ecological trauma across species with whom we share so much kinship as we watch our precious habitats change, wither, and disappear. In response, artists like Erin Wiersma, Terry Conrad, and Joan Sabraw create works that remind us that it is more important than ever to reconnect with nature and renew our vows to steward it with commitment, awareness, and accountability. Joan Sabraw is an artist, activist, and environmentalist whose paintings, drawings, and collaborative installations are produced in an eco-conscious manner, working towards a fully sustainable practice. Sabraw works with environmental engineer and Ohio University professor Guy Reifler to remediate streams polluted by abandoned coal mine seepage in southeastern Ohio. Sabraw's work is part of numerous collections, including the Museum of Contemporary Art Honolulu, the Elmhurst Art Museum, Emprise Bank, and Accenture Corporation. He has recently been featured in TED, Smithsonian, New Scientist, London, The Discovery, and Great Big Stories. John is professor of art at Ohio University, where he also chairs the painting and drawing program. Erin Wiersma's artistic practice focuses on the body's capacity to absorb and respond to an environment. Based in the Flint Hills of Kansas, she creates works on paper with the land at Konza Prairie Biological Station, one of the few remaining protected grasslands in the world. Her work has been featured in the journal Minding Nature from the Center for Humans and Nature, OnVerge at the Q Foundation, Art21 Online Magazine, and Two Coats of Paint. Erin received her BA from Messiah College and completed her MFA at the University of Connecticut. She is Associate Professor of Art at Kansas State University. Terry Conrad is an artist interested in the community aspects of printmaking and the trace materials found within the landscape. In 2014, he was awarded a grant to develop the Adirondack Forum, a collapsible venue made of old painting blocks and other found wood that functioned as a meeting place, performance space, and classroom. He received his BFA from Alfred University and his MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art. Terry is an assistant professor of printmaking at the University of Iowa. So welcome to all of our panelists. And just to clarify today's format, each of our artists will give a mini artist talk, which I'll follow up with some questions that I've solicited from students, and we'll follow that up with a panel discussion that I'll do my best to moderate. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Erin so that we can get started with her artist talk.
Thank you, David. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement from my home, Kansas. The state of Kansas is historically home to many Native nations including Nakaw, Osage, Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is a current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sauk Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. My drawings emerge from a need to listen deeply to the land. The act of drawing becomes a conversation between myself and my environment. The space that emerges invites me into a state of wonderment. A heightened sense of listening allows me to experience the whole environment and then the individual beings of the land. Ultimately, this work uses the latent, innate abilities we don't practice enough in our society today: paying attention. Based in the Flint Hills of Kansas, I'm creating work on paper with the land at Konza Prairie Biological Station, one of the fewest remaining protected grasslands in the world. Konza Prairie Biological Station is owned by the Nature Conservancy and managed by Kansas State University. It is a part of the National Science Foundation long-term ecological research program. Having access to the station side by side with the researchers allow me to develop a deep relationship with my environment and the land. For tens of thousands of years, fire and bison maintain the prairie. At the biological station, scientists are studying the life cycle of the prairie ecosystem and symbiotic relationship, as neither one could exist without the other. The land in these drawings tell stories about what the tall grass prairie was and what it is now. The Flint Hill, with its shallow, rocky soil, was impervious to the plow, and thus the prairie remains there today, in this place like the Konza Prairie. Once stretching throughout the Great Plains as far south as Texas, the tall grass prairie has dwindled to bare minimum of its impervious size. Roughly 4% remains. My practice involves many hours spent on site walking the land and is informed by awareness of and response to the wind, temperature, humidity, geological time, and the topography of the terrain. Visually, the work results in drawings that are reminiscent of the prairie in the visual growth patterns. And I work with the natural growth such as prairie grasses and forbs in all life stages. The plant matter, once charred by fire, allows for a more direct representation of the land. These drawings are made by pulling, rubbing, dragging, lifting the paper in the Kansas prairie before and after a controlled burn. The fire immediately transformed the land, and it is only really at this point that we see and experience the rawness of the barren earth. In this moment, I can experience the transitional moment of rejuvenation. It is the grasses that start fresh in each cycle are scorched to their stumps and forced to begin anew. It's also those same grasses that nourish the land in their destruction, allowing the process to continue. Time and location can be also noted in types of vegetation and mark in the work. These walks are not choreographed. As I walk, I read the land. During the fire, I walk towards the fire line. After the burn is passed, I'll retrace my path to the fire, and I'll notice whatever the land brings in that particular space and moment. Maybe it's intensity of the heat, the char versus the ash, and seeing where that path is. Living beings, their remains, them scurrying away, or the paths that are carved into that canopy of grasses. Entering within the prairie, as I find my way from the highlands into the hills, I traverse along the alternating layers of limestone benches and slopes, each step downward, accounting for tens of thousands of years of time. And I take this path until I descend into the Royal, the lowest part of the ancient inland seabed from the Permian period. It is here where I find myself to be in the most sacred place of the prairie. Home to the native population of this region, now home to fossilized remains of what once was, and now markers of this passage of deep time. There's also a space where these drawings are at once documents, records of the land, but also autobiographical in nature. The titling of the most recent works offer a more direct referential notation for the viewer, beginning with the day of the year, the place, and often noting the location in the watershed. There's also secondary titling or subtitling that happens, which is personal and notes what I may be experiencing at that moment, or who and what I carried in that space with me. In every season, there's also new elements to tend with in the prairie, moment by moment. On the 123rd day of 2019, I was caught in a shower. Seeing a storm rolling in on land is something indescribable. I enjoy witnessing the reflection too on the paper as it's shown in the marks made at that moment. It's also reflective of the evolution of the dialogue between myself and the work. When I display these works, I hope to convey a primal need to evoke the latent parts of ourselves, the need to pay attention, to see, through this act of drawing with the land. I seek to address the capacity within us to seek understanding and to evoke wonderment, to examine the value of the land. I came to the land from a desire to hope to know that space with a sense of reverence. If the drawings allow for the viewer to find a similar reverence or an appreciation of their own landscape, that is my hope.
Erin, that was great. Thanks for sharing. I have some questions I've solicited from students, and I just ask you a few of them. First of all, there seem to be a lot of concerns about your safety when working in the prairie. And so I wonder if you could talk to whether your process is dangerous from your perspective and if you've ever been burned or injured while making a drawing.
That's a great question. I'm making work after the burn has passed. And so I'm never crossing into the fire line because I have no reason to go into the unburned grasses. Out of respect, I joined the burn crew and completed all the training so I could really understand what was happening. We always wear cotton. So if you wear synthetic clothes, that's where it can become really dangerous. If an ember were to catch onto your clothing. And so with cotton on the burn crew, you can actually walk through that fire line. The grasses burn very fast. So it's a hot fire, but it's a quick fire, if that makes sense. And then when I'm making the work, I'm walking towards the fire. I'm never really jumping that fire line. The only time I'm jumping the fire lines, I'm actually on the burn crew, and I may need to get on the other side to strip the land, creating sequence of burned strips. And we do that for back burns. So the burn is moving really slowly. And so it doesn't matter if you cross that fire line. So I actually get hotter when I'm on the burn crew than when I'm actually working on the land, making my drawings, because I can step back and wait for a head fire to pass, right? But if I'm on hose, I really need to take that. My job is really to take out the fire at that specific moment in time.
One question from our color theory class came from a student who was curious about whether particular plants or maybe, particular parts of the prairie give off any type of coloration. And another student was curious whether you can expect certain effects. Can you predict certain effects based on, I don't know, how close you are to the burn or the location you are within the prairie. So if you could speak a little bit more to your process and how you view the kind of like co-poetic relationship you have with the landscape.
Sure, yeah. Konza Prairie has experimental watersheds. There's over 50 of them. They study how grazing and burning cultivates the prairie, maintains the prairie, right? And so when it comes to fire, most of the watersheds happen in the spring, because that's a traditional time when burning happens. But they're also studying what happens in the fall with a burn and what happens in the winter and also summer. So time of year is important, right? But equally so is how often is the prairie burned. And so the vegetation, that plant composition will look drastically different in a 4-year burn than, let's say, an annual spring burn. And so in the 4-year burns, we get more of that woody matter. And they're different woody matter, just to speak a little bit to color, creates different marks. So the sumac, the invasive sumac, and then getting even to those wildflowers that have a stockiness to them that could release a color and pigment. Every season, the work transforms, and each time it seems to catch me by surprise. And I believe that the char, depending on the intensity of the burn and what is being burned, and the moisture in the air really transforms that color of black. There's like an infinite color of blacks on the land. So thank you for asking that.
Yeah, that's such an interesting response. And it's interesting to think about the way in which like your personal history and your personal narratives like overlay and interweave with those sort of ecological and deep time histories of the landscape. So it's really interesting to think about. Thank you for that response. So let's go ahead and we'll turn it over to Terry Conrad now for his artist talk.
Thank you, everyone at the College of DuPage. It's a real honor to be able to share my work with you. So I wanted to start by sharing a bit of a collaboration that I've been working on. So this is a collaborator of mine named Dr. Joan Bernhardt. She's a senior scientist of geology and geophysics at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And she's been studying Foraminifera for decades. Foraminifera are single-celled organisms. And she is particularly interested in these Foraminifera that are thriving and adapting in dead zones in the ocean. So here are a couple of examples of Foraminifera, and they're etchings that I made in response to some images that Dr. Bernhardt showed me early on in the project. And it was a way for me to learn about the forams, sort of more in a formal sense. So there are several different kinds, like I said. This is another species of Foraminifera, but this is a shell or a test. And this is actually built through collecting stuff. The previous foramine was sort of built by secreting calcium carbonate. And this one, the Foraminifera has these arms, pseudopods, that would go and grab objects in the ocean and build this structure mixed with calcium carbonate. So in May of 2018, I was invited to spend 10 days on a research vessel, the Robert Gordon Sproul, that traveled from San Diego to Santa Barbara. So I was hanging out with marine biologists, chemists, PhD candidates, and the ship's crew in an effort to eventually make prints and sculpture in response to Dr. Bernhardt's work. This tool is called the MC800, and this is an event where we are dropping the piece into the ocean, and it was going down 600 meters to then collect mud. And what it has is these cores, these plexiglass tubes, essentially, that when it would go down to the bottom of the ocean, a button would be pressed and these tubes would slam into the floor and then pull up the mud, and we would slowly bring it up to the top of the ship. And this event would take maybe 50 minutes. But the important thing to note is this is the bottom of the ocean. There's seawater and then that's the bottom of the ocean. It's really, the idea is these tools leave it undisturbed. So the forams live in this top layer of mud at the bottom of the sea. And so then we would take this mud and we would put it into little vials. And we were working sort of at all hours of the night and day. It was, we had proper sleep and all that, but it was just constant sort of work to collect. So there was this walk-in cooler on the ship where I spent most of my time. I think it's really, I was in California, but I actually was in this sort of walk-in cooler that was where we stored all of the mud and all the seawater. And my job was to kind of take the different muds from all the different events, as well as the seawater, and put them in these little jars. So now jumping to a project that I made in response to Dr. Bernhardt's work. This is a time-based printing press that I call Biomarkers. All the materials you see are collected from the experience I mentioned previous, where whether it was visiting Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute or going out on the ship, I was just collecting stuff to make this structure that has this sort of nautical sort of thing happening. Here are some details of the piece. And all the inks were made in this process. In those previous images, you'd see that structure. It has these tubes and they all go down to these open bottom vessels. And it prints on the paper over the course of 3 to 4 days. So I'm using oxidized metals, mud, dirt, all things that were sort of gleaned from that printing press, that collecting process. Here's an example of some of the greens that I was making from the piece Biomarkers, that previous press that you saw. And this is actually dried out mud from the bottom of the ocean, where I was also turning into ink. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, this is just water that I was filling up with concrete mixing trays and letting the water evaporate over and over again. And so it just left this sort of calcium in these concrete mixing trays. Then I would scrape them out and print. This piece is a combination of using some of the mud from Santa Barbara Basin, as well as the water from my studio. And the orange you see is actually the metal breaking down that is within that printing press. That printing press is titled Biomarkers. And biomarkers are essentially a trace, a foreign trace of another substance in a being. And I kind of am interested in that idea of thinking about a trace of a foreign substance in a living being that sort of tells a story. So thank you so much.
Wow, Terry, thanks so much for that. Really interesting work and what an amazing experience. So I have some questions that I collected from students in advance, and a lot of the work that they had seen of yours came from your recent exhibition or your current exhibition, Object Permanence. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that exhibition, and maybe even I had some students asking about the title of that exhibition, Object Permanence.
Sure, yeah, so, Object Permanence. I should first off say is that I have a 1-year-old daughter, and so if you know object permanence, this idea of that something exists even though it's not in front of you, that moment of learning that. That was something I was ruminating on all this year, having a daughter, but then also being within the pandemic and thinking about all of us that not seeing each other, not being around family, friends, and that, but also this time of learning about all this change that is happening in the world, people that are having different experiences than us. A lot of reasons why this title came around based on what was going on culturally, but then also thinking about object permanence in terms of the lack of conversation or around science and the things that exist that maybe we don't know the full story to. I kind of think of some ways of my job in collaborating with scientists sometimes is to be to share information and to maybe point out why certain things, research it might be happening. So pointing out something that's there, maybe even though it's not in front of you, not knowing about it. So there's many reasons I think where that title started to make sense even after I made the title or chose the title. So.
Yeah, it often kind of works that way, right? You're making more connections even after the fact.
Sure.
So, these objects that you're coming across throughout the process of being on the ship, are any of those household items? Because some students were curious about like, what types of household items were you coming across regularly? And like, are there small actions or household items that we should be maybe being more careful with, or things that we should be making more effort to repurpose in our own lives?
Well, I think what I jumped to, I should say that there's many objects like the presses that you just saw. The parameters were all around this science project, but yes, I do, collect things, say, just out in the street, things that are just discarded on the side of the road, But something that I can't help but think about is certain things that maybe are going to the dump that are really have a lot of life left in them. A component of the work I do also, there's a sound component. So just for example, a project that I'm kind of working on right now is making microphones or electromagnetic pickups from old cell phone chargers. And so oftentimes those can be recycled, but a lot of times they're just thrown out, and so I find those are so ubiquitous now, old cell phone chargers. So going in and taking out the copper coil and unwinding it and then winding it on something else to make an electromagnetic pickup, it's copper, this really special metal that's really beautiful and has so many uses. I also want to add, if I didn't go over it today much, but I love tin cans. This idea of tin cans has been this constant in my work. And the beauty of that, it's kind of different. They already exist oftentimes in a recycling bin. And I get to collect them, cut them up, play with them, build these forms. And if it's not working out, I just put them back. I just wanted to add that. That's an important part of my process.
Sure, great. So I think we can hear a little bit more from you too in the Q&A as we move forward. I have some questions for all the panelists. So thanks, Terry, I really appreciate it.
Sure.
So I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and move along to John's talk, hear a little bit from John, and I'll have some questions for you as well. And Erin, we'll look forward to hearing more from you during the panel later.
Thanks, David. So one of the worst legacies of coal mining is acid mine drainage. And this pollution kills most of the aquatic life in over 1,300 streamed miles in Ohio alone. Now, the first time I see this iron oxide sludge, I'm thinking artist paints throughout history have been made with iron oxides. Could I make paints out of this acid mine drainage iron? And a short while later, I actually get introduced to engineering professor Guy Riefler, who it turns out had the same thought. What if this iron sludge pollution could be sold as a valuable resource rather than disposed of as a waste product? So we came up with this process. Now, initially, the acid mine drainage pollution, when it comes out of the mine, has high concentrations of dissolved sulfuric acid and iron. And so it actually looks clear, which is deceiving. So we take this clear acid mine drainage pollution and we neutralize the acidity first by adding a base. And that makes the iron crystals appear, and they're kind of blue-green, which means that they really want to attach to oxygen. And so we give them oxygen, either chemically or by running them over stuff outside and just letting the air do it. But whatever happens, you get orange, which is iron oxide crystals. They're heavy, they go to the bottom, and you have clean, safe water on top that you can return to the stream. And then we take that iron sludge that's left over and we dry it and we grind it, and boom, you get pigments. It's that simple. But while this basic chemistry is not revolutionary, finding a way to do it so that the extracted iron oxide is a valuable byproduct is. And so this is why Guy wanted my help. What makes a good pigment, you know? So I told him I could definitely work with them to achieve a better pigment quality, but I thought what we also needed was beauty. So I began to use the iron oxide pigment in a mix of other standard artist colors to make paintings that build a contemplative dynamic relating to the sublimity of nature, but also the fragility of our current relationship with it. And the paintings, of course, changed as the pigment changed, because we worked from our initial color of pigment, which is this, which can only be described in excrement terms, not something desirable, finally into something that was fun to work with. And this is the raw iron that we're getting now from the initial part of our process. And it's much more fun to paint with. So we also figured out that there are ways of getting new pigment colors by firing them at different temperatures for short periods of time. So that same raw pigment, if we fired it like a mid-range temperature, it actually turns this burgundy, which is freaking amazing and really fun to paint with, I'll tell you that. And then when we crank it up to an even higher temperature, to our surprise, the iron compounds that we have actually turned into this violet, which no one predicted and is really, really, really fun to paint with, you know? So about the time this is happening, I developed a relationship with a large paint company, Gamblin Artist Colors. And they've helped us to ensure that our pigments are non-toxic, light fast, stable, and that they meet the highest standards for artist colors. And a few years ago, Gamblin produced our first batch of oil paint using our pigment, which you see here. And then just last year, the day that the world shut down, we released this pack of 3 colors, a reclaimed earth colors, which is fantastic, still available in your local art supply store. So if you really wanted some paint, this would be a really great thing to buy. Just saying that, just putting it out there, you know. But as our pigments and paints are now reaching artists around the world, I am constantly aware that none of this would be happening without so many students, partners, volunteers, and citizens who've joined our cause. And our activities finally drew interest recently from outside agencies. And we've been working in a new partnership with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. And together, our project was awarded $3.5 million last year to build a full-scale treatment plant at the worst acid mine site in Ohio, here in Truetown. Now, when built, this facility will treat over 1 million gallons of pollution a day and return miles of stream to full health while producing over 5,000 pounds of sustainably sourced pigment every day for generations to come. So this is my new pet project, because while the treatment facility, let's see, you can see here in the top part in the north, that's where the treatment facility will be. But we envision opening up the remaining southern 11+ acres of land as a public, ecological, educational sculpture park to use as an experiential place-based learning lab. And art students have helped me to design this wetland area on the property. We envision, again, this kind of sculpture garden, walking paths, native flora and fauna, interpretive signs, and much, much more. So this outdoor learning lab could be utilized for all disciplines, including environmental studies, geography, biological sciences, engineering, art, K-12 schools, you name it. Because the plant itself will also be open for tours, which is great. But I got to tell you, when we first showed this design to the Department of Natural Resources guys, you should have seen their faces. It was absolutely hilarious. And then they worked with it, though. They were kind of calm. They worked with it. And it turns out that this would cost over $600,000 to make. So we kind of had to go back to the drawing board. But the great thing is our students just redesigned this just last week. And instead of like, you know, we're going to use walking berms instead of boardwalks and other kinds of things. And we've made some other changes. And we think that this will actually work within the budget we have now. And literally a few hours from now, we're actually having a meeting with Department of Natural Resources where I'll present this design to them for the first time. So we're going to see what their faces look like this time and what we can move forward with. But it's quite a day today, and I'm happy to be here talking with Terry, Erin, and everybody. So thanks for having me.
Wow, thanks for that, John. I actually didn't really know much about that new project of yours. That's really exciting. I've also solicited some questions from students for you, if you don't mind, and a lot of them do have questions about those pigments. And so one of them would like to know, how you, if you could speak more about controlling the coloration of the pigments. You talked about like this kind of undesirable color, and then how you have to kind of work the pigments to achieve colors that you would like. Are there any colors that you aren't able to achieve, or are there colors that you would like to be able to achieve?
That's a very good question. Yeah. This is actually, we've been working on this for 10 years now, and nearly everything we do is a complete failure. Just about everything. And so early colors, like I showed in that slide, were really just, I don't know, leftover pea soup on the porch for 6 months, really bad stuff. And it turns out that there is a really, really complex chemical situation in every single seep. They literally could be a quarter mile down the road, because there's a lot of seeps in Ohio. And all this pollution is coming out, and they look the same, and it looks orange, and you're like, it's got to be the same. And so you go and apply the same technique to it. No, it doesn't give you any joy. So, I mean, we get most of them, like, so, you come to a seep and it has like a little bit of weird stuff floating in it, mostly clear, like I showed in the video. And then we go and we add stuff to it, and we get it to precipitate into whatever it is. But even though it might precipitate this color, when you dry it and grind it, depending on the grind, depending on temperature, oxygen sat rates, everything, you can end up with something like this, which is a reasonable color, but not like a great color. So we'll have to work with one seep for months and months and years to make sure that that chemistry, then we can change it so that when it precipitates, it is the color that we want. Now, initially precipitation with iron oxide is nearly always going to be in the sort of orangish brown range, because it's the nature of iron oxide, right? That's just what it does. It's what the crystal formation is. You can add heat to it, and you can change it to a lot of different things. So you can actually end up with kind of the three main categories of iron oxides. So you could have like goethite, which is very yellow, or you can have hematite, which is more orange-red, or you can have magnetite, right, which is black-brown. And at the seeps, mostly what we get is a hematite, which is interesting. So in that range, in that orange to red to like burgundy range is what we end up with. That's about the limit of the color range. Okay, you can get something very yellow, kind of like a yellow ochre out of the tube, and you can get something, again, when we fire it crazy, right? We get like this weird violet, which nobody anticipated getting. I mean, it's fantastic. So we're still, we've done X-ray diffraction on this stuff, and the X-ray diffraction is like, I don't know, so not super helpful. So really, it's about one seep, one chemistry, and working with that for a long time. And that also, though, has to pair with, and this is most important, in order to make this work, because when we make money from this plant, I wish that money was coming to me, to be honest. I wish I could make some money out of this. But all the money goes into cleaning up other pollution sites, right? So we need to make money out of it. So controlling the color is very, very important, because there are particular prices in particular markets on the industrial scale for these different colors. So for us, that's why we work so hard to control that color, so that we know when we are producing, well, when we're cleaning up 1 million gallons a day and producing 5,000 pounds of pigment a day, we don't have a different color on Monday than we have on Wednesday. Was that even remotely what the question was, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit it. Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
And another question that a couple of students had was more about the paintings themselves and your sort of circular format. They're just curious about, it seems like a lot of your work sort of follows this sort of like circular kind of patterning, and they're just curious, why is that a form you keep returning to in your work? Does it relate to the overall, message or underlying meanings of your work?
Yeah, well, I'd like to pay your students to be my therapist and figure out why this circle keeps coming up. That'd be awesome. The truth of the matter is that, so I don't know what's on the internet anymore, but most of my early career was as a hyper-realist painter in oil paint. In Chicago, I was at Union Cub and at Tom McCormick Gallery, and I was painting all these little hyper still lives and figurative paintings and landscapes and things that were super detailed and super intense and everything. And one day I was, when I really got into being more of an activist in terms of sustainability in the environment, and really like writing letters and publishing stuff and going to protests and doing things like that, I was getting clogged with all this weird kind of lack of action, right? Just because you're making noise doesn't mean things are happening, So when I dug deeper, I started looking at sustainability as a whole. And now I think we have better language to talk about it more recently, where we're really talking about climate justice. And when you look at the core of these things, this is about sharing resources, right? And that's about sustainability. And that's about climate justice, right? And within that, of course, is, you know, racial inequality, gender, like forget it, you name it. The whole gamut is within it. So when I began to think about that huge of an idea, it crippled me as a painter. I was like, how do you paint that? It's too big. So I was actually trying to make all these things that made sense out of it, using my little like, you know, kind of stuff. And they sucked. It was terrible work. Couldn't show the work. And then one day, literally, this is true. One day I was like, just kind of feeling the utter failure of being a terrible artist. And I spilled a bunch of stuff. And I was so I went out with a teenage hissy fit and I left the studio for like a week or so. And I came back to face it. And all that stuff, all the colors I had mixed that I wanted to use had pooled into a circle that was more what my mind and heart wanted to say than me trying to be like super specific about it. So after that, that's when I began to incorporate the circular form. And so for me, it's something that I return to like again and again. And you can see where the sausage is made. You know, all my crazy paints and stuff. And so now as I think about all different aspects of it, as they get made, most of the time they start out as circle ideas only because the ideas are too big for me to get that specific with. And the way they're made is that I'm actually paint them on the floor and I'm sitting there usually making really bad art for about 7 layers. And then finally, with one final layer, like I'll realize, oh, it's about this. And the last layer, I'll clean it up and I'll be like, that's what it is. That's what I felt. That's what I'm trying to say. And like, so for me, the circles do that because they give the viewer this chance to come into it and think of it as looking through a microscope or a telescope or a drone shot or a satellite shot. And it gives them the opportunity to have their own authentic experience with like, you know, what they feel in nature, what emotional contact they have. And so when I have a show, the coolest thing is I'll be sitting there like talking to people and then like I'll see someone over at one of my paintings and they'll be like looking at it real weird and they'll just turn around and just be like, you know, and they'll look at me and they'll like come across the room and they'll be like, that painting, I know what that is. When I was a kid and I was at Niagara Falls and whatever else, and you know, that's not what I'm thinking, but I'm like, yes, you are absolutely right. You are 100% right. Because then the conversation we can have is a common conversation about what kind of action we can take. And that's my goal out of those.
Yeah, wow. Thanks for that, John. What a great story. It's amazing how those sort of happy studio accidents can open up, you know, entire new realms, new bodies of work, new ways of thinking. Really appreciate that and look forward to talking to you more in a little bit. I've also collected some questions from students for all of our panelists, and these are some questions I'm very interested in as well. So the first one really has to do with how you view your work, maybe even working in concert with science. You know, how can art and science work together towards environmental advocacy, or how you see your work as a tool for environmental advocacy?
I think from my perspective, there was a lot to learn about collaborating with science and what science can do with art to advocate for this stuff. And I think that there's a thing that we have as artists that oftentimes in the profession of the sciences they don't have, and that is the freedom to not have to do it exactly right every time. And like if I want to come in and make a blue painting, I can make a blue painting, you know. And science doesn't always have that that freedom of outlet. And so we can come in and, I mean, I'm looking at those shots of you, Erin, in that black space with that white piece of paper around there, and it reminded me that we have a sensibility of a spatial awareness and a spatial imagination that I think is innate in us. It's a driving force in what we do as artists that can really help us visualize how we might intersect, you know, science, activism, art, even if it's messy. That understanding how that space is mobile and where certain points might be places where we can apply pressure, where we can have that done. I think that that's something that we have as artists and can bring to the table working with scientists and other advocacy groups they don't necessarily have. And I've seen it work in very different ways from my own personal experience, where in terms of proposals and thinking, scientists are often trying to solve a problem, or an advocacy group is trying to solve a very simple problem. And they're going to be good at it and they know what to do with it, and they're incredibly valuable people. But within that moment, there's an opportunity for us as artists to see how that intersects in real time with other community concerns, with other ways to turn that into an artwork, whether it's public or whatever it is, where the larger intentions of all these groups environmentally, that can be something that opens it up to a public conversation and a public interaction. And so when I think about that, that's kind of the first thing that comes to my mind.
I've really enjoyed working on the station alongside scientists, whether it's the scientists on the burn crew, or if it's just walking the land with them. There is no pressure that I have to unite the science and the art, and that's been really wonderful. I've been able to go in there and really be an artist. I wish you could see these works in person. They feel, when they're done, almost like tapestries. I work on paper, but the paper absorbs in it the land itself and the indentations of the rocks. They have dimension on the edge and literally on the edge and the surface, right? And it was pretty conflicted of how to show the science when I sent these works off to galleries, for instance. Some venues are not as interested in having the science be the forerunner, right? And so I think that the video has been very helpful in working with the drone pilot, Everett Nelson. We've been able to show people in the gallery what this landscape really looks like and start a conversation. I started working with a landscape architect, feels like a long time now, Katie King-Reed Page. And it just started with a conversation after I gave a public presentation within our community. And we looked and examined how we could take both our loves for the prairie and combine them and find some kind of marriage of sorts. So we came up with, over time, a project called Grassland Interview. And it has these different components. And Katie, in the gallery, Katie is showing her work, which is an audio piece. She has these sound domes that you can stand under, and that's her preferred method, although there's other ways of adapting to different venues. And in that audio piece, she's taking recordings of the scientists that she interviews, and she edits out her voice. So you get this beautiful, eloquent voice of scientist for himself or herself speaking. And I've loved that effort and that presentation where the scientists could just speak for themselves and the artwork can just speak for itself. And then we have this other engagement where we have this urgency, I guess you'd say, to work with communities. And so we've worked with several high schools putting together, the final product is a mural, but leading up to that mural, there's an ecological service component to the presentation. So our targeted age that we really love working with is high school students, helping them understand why these grasslands are so important. So they're drawing their plants, and then we do this experiential component drawing, and we make a mural out of that. So I haven't really directly pulled the sciences in beyond my titling. I enjoy letting other people do what they're good at, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting too, that it doesn't always have to be, that this is art and science. Art and science both have, what they can contribute, and they can be parallel, but they don't always have to intersect.
I would say that I think artists can actually help scientists in sharing what their research is. I think that I have worked with, I think artists have this problem of using jargon and alienating an audience sometimes. And I think scientists might have the same issue sometimes. And I think that the more we can cross over disciplines and have more people sharing from different perspectives, I think that having the conversation going. So I think that I think we really can help by sort of sort of a mouthpiece for the scientists and share the many aspects of why what they're doing is important.
Thank you. students are really curious about your process, because of course we try to teach as many different types of art and artists as we can in our program. But each of you have, such a unique approach to making work. And so one question that I came across a couple times from students is, what are the recurring challenges that are unique to your process? What are the challenges that you are constantly having to sort of come face to face with and overcome?
So when something gets exhibited, oftentimes it gets sold, particularly if it's in a more commercial gallery. And when those sell, it does this really bad thing to my brain. And it goes, well, if you make that again, you could sell that again and you'll make money off of that again. And then you could afford to like not bleed the family income and still support your really bad hobby of making art. But time and time again, what I learned is that if I try to replicate something in a commercial production fashion, those are paintings that I give away to relatives for free 10 years down the line because no one wants to buy them. But I constantly have that struggle, that challenge of being like, can I be free enough in the studio to trust myself instinctually and to trust that urge to communicate in a way that even seems vague and indulgent because of the time required and materials required or the crazy thought I have, constantly trying to psych myself into being like, it's okay to just trust yourself and be an artist in the space in a shrinking time that you have to make those things. Let that happen, let it be organic. That's the real challenge I have. And it reoccurs all the time.
Some of the challenges that I face when making the work out in the land is really the climate and the timing. The wind is quite challenging. We can't even have a burn if it's over 15 mile per hour, and that sweet spot is between 8 and 10 mile per hour. And then back in the studio, I think archiving is one of the hardest challenge for all artists probably who deal with multiples. How do you keep track of these works? How do you fix them if they're charcoal in this case, and document them? And I've found a solution to deal with these. I've embraced this challenge by having a good team of students that I've hired to help prepare to work for exhibition, and always have had wonderful photographers to document the work properly. The challenges, I think, are important, and from them, I think we refine or dig deeper into the practice itself.
Can I just add something? Erin just said something that sparked a thought. The three of us artists, I think, another thing we have in common is thinking about maybe where the studio starts and ends. I think the idea of the studio is really important to think about for students, particularly once you leave school and you leave this place that has great space. And then all of a sudden you might move to a city, and then you're sharing a room or sharing an apartment with many people. And I think it's important to know that it's a process. It can be a process. That not having a studio could be an opportunity. Think of the opportunity in what you have and shifting your focus when you leave school.
That's a great point, Terry. And I think that's one thing that I've always respected about artists, is that there's this interest in what is and what's there, and not necessarily in what's not there, what isn't, right? So the last question I have from students is, and maybe this is more of a question for me, but what's the next thing that you're working on that you're excited about? Is there anything upcoming, either in the current project or a future project that you'd like to share a little bit about or plug at all? I'd love to hear about it.
We're at the end of the burn season at Konza Prairie Biological Station. So this afternoon I'll be out torching. That's what's next, is to continue making work. And then this fall, I'm really excited to be part of a show entitled Earthly Observatory at the SAIC Galleries. And then at the end of September, I'll be over in Salina, Kansas at the Land Institute, as they have an annual prairie festival. And this year they asked me to be their prairie artist. So pretty excited about those opportunities after this year of making and being still and being solitude and land.
Well, coming off of sort of the largest show I've had personally. I'm really looking forward to having some studio time. And I have, I mentioned a little bit about what I'm starting to work on, which is these sort of sound-based sculptural print-ish objects that are, made of found materials. I'm really kind of excited about what I could learn from the other collaborators, but then also I always find that when I make a tool, I make the tool and I had this plan for it and I think I know it, but it really takes me making a print or making a recording 10 times before I learn the potential of it. But then when somebody else is then looking at it, there's a different kind of potential brought into it. And so I'm really excited about digging into making more of these noisemakers / electromagnetic pickups and microphones from found materials.
So I just started a new collaboration with Draper Labs at MIT, and they have sent me some of their first successful samples of lab-grown wood fiber. So I'm actually looking forward to partnerships like that where it's not as intensive as the 10-year project I've been on now, but it's small ways in which I can create just almost maybe even distinct little artworks where I can partner with someone who's doing something that's really at the very forefront of trying to solve environmental and sustainable solutions and issues of climate justice, rather than thinking in terms of the scope of these projects. So I'm looking forward to that. I've got some samples here. It's pretty cool. I kind of ruined the samples because, it's the first samples. So I have sort of sent an apologetic email and back and everything. But those little projects I've decided that I'm going to make time to do little things like that. And there's a lot of them coming up. And I don't know if I can even make art worth a crap out of it or something that they'll be happy with or anything. But just to be able to reach out to more people and understand more and be able to communicate that, I think that's something that I've decided I can take on as a role. And I'm only 78%, afraid of totally failing in all those. That's pretty exciting. And the other thing I'm really excited about is going out and picking up some black pigment from Erin in the Konza Prairie Station when I go out there in June. Because I've been out there and that place is like amazing. Like when you're out there, there's no bigger sky on the planet than when you're out there. And it's the total opposite of where I work. I'm down in all these hollows in the Appalachian Hills, and you look up and it's just, insects falling on your head and leaves and everything. And you go out there to the prairie and it's just like, forever. And when you were talking about those storms coming in, Erin, I was like, crap, girl, I hope you have a big old truck, because when those things come rolling in, it's a black line that's in Denver and you can watch it come all the way for like 16 hours and smack you in the face. It's terrifying. But that's what I'm looking forward to.
Thank you for those great responses to all the student questions, and really thank you so much for your work and your effort and your time today. I really appreciate it, and I think it's a great way for us to finish up our Visiting Artist Series for the 2020 and 2021 season. So thanks again, Terry and John and Erin.